now everyone has arrived, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you here at the University of Copenhagen to our conference, workshop and PhD course on trauma, memory and media. A warm welcome to all of you who have come from near and from far and all the way from the US and from Israel and from Paris just arrived. Let me say a few words about the background of this conference. It originates in a workshop on memory, identity and limits of understanding that took place also here in Copenhagen in October 2013. And among the speakers were Rachel Rosenblum and Dayan. And in his talk on the anthropology of witnessing, Dayan referred to the testimony of a mother and a daughter who survived the Holocaust together. It was a testimony that was recorded at the Fortenhof Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies at Yale University, where Dori Laub is working. And it was presented by Johanna Bodenstab and Dori Laub at another conference in Prague in 2013. Now, during our workshop here, Dayan analyzed the gestures involved in a narrative from a sociological and a media theoretical point of view. And Rachel spoke about traumatized memory and family relations. Although we did not screen the video testimony, which we will do now, today, this testimony of the mother and the daughter and its traumatic, indeed haunting story about an infanticide that both women witnessed in a concentration camp in Hamburg, Eidelstedt, it stayed with me and also with other participants in this workshop. I then felt the need of organizing some event where we would have the opportunity to analyze interviews with Holocaust survivors from multiple perspectives. And now, approximately 2 years later, this idea has become reality. In the coming 3 days, we will discuss testimonies from different points of view, including psychoanalysis and psychiatry, existential phenomenology, and media sociology. We will focus on specific hermeneutic problems surfacing in audio-visual Holocaust testimonies. How are we to interpret manifestations of the absent within the represented? Trying to clarify how meaning can be aligned with silences, halts, stutters, blank spaces in disrupted speech, or bewildered looks and gestures. Our aim is not only to explore the contents of these accounts, but also to reflect upon the role of the medium used to convey them, namely video interviews combining narrative and image. An investigation of these multi-layered, very complex sources, which are oversaturated with verbal and non-verbal meaning, is vital when we address such questions as, what do these witness accounts show concerning the problem of articulating and coping with a traumatic, nearly unbearable past? And how may interlocutors respond to such testimonies in a manner that minimizes the risk of re-traumatization? And last but not least, how can compassionate listeners guard themselves against secondary traumatization? Thus far about the conference theme. I'm delighted that leading experts in the field have accepted the invitation to Copenhagen and will give lectures and share their insights with us. However, there is one person who was also among the invited speakers and whose work is central for our conference, who cannot be with us today. Johanna Bodenstab. She succumbed to cancer on April 23 this year. As can be read on the website of the Genocide Studies program at Yale University, Johanna along with her husband Dory Laub, and I quote, was a pioneer in the study of the testimony by Holocaust survivors. She often provided a soothing presence for those giving testimony about devastating trauma, as she assisted with interviewing survivors. This conference won't be the same without Johanna. She is and she will be sorely missed. We will dedicate this conference to her and her work, and we will present her path-breaking work on the infanticide vignette, which has given the idea for this whole event, in a special session a little later this afternoon. Wishing us all a fruitful and inspiring conference, I will now give the word to Amit Pinchevsky, who will chair the first session and the opening lecture by Dayan.
Hello everybody. Thank you very much, Claudia, and I'll thank you tomorrow as well, more formally, but thank you for the invitation and for this wonderful hospitality and arranging this very important, I think, conference. And I have the pleasure of introducing my friend, Dayan, who is a fellow of the Marcel Mauss Institute in Paris, and is a visiting professor at the New York School for Social Research. He is very well known around media studies and sociology, also as a film expert, and also as a past student of Roland Barthes. His current work focuses on understanding the role of media in managing social attention, sociology of attention, and based on the anthropology and aesthetics of witnessing. In 2010, he received the ICA Fellow, the International Communication Association, Fellow Award for Media Events, the live broadcasting of history. It's co-authored with Elihu Katz, a key work in media studies, and it was translated to very many different languages. He edited more recently Le Terror au Spectacle, Terrorisme à Télévision, and also owning the Olympics, narratives of the new China, with Monroe Prize for the Michigan University Press. That's in 2008, and many other publications which we don't really have time for me to review. And other than being a dear friend of me and a wonderful conversation companion, he's also an outstanding speaker, as I'm sure you will shortly see. So without further ado, Daniel.
I may be an outstanding speaker, but I'm a very mediocre stander. In that, as a French lecturer, I'm used to speak while sitting. I'll manage, but I just wanted to warn that from time to time, I might get away from the mic. I think that I have been invited many times in Copenhagen. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm almost, how to say, I came so often that I'm almost a faculty. So I want to thank you for inviting me yet another time. And I want also to dedicate my presentation to Johanna, whom I remember when she picked me at the station when I came to visit from New York. And we had always wonderful conversations, very different, but quite continuous with those I had later with Dory Laub. And the third element of my presentation is that I studied to become a director. Before being an academic, I wanted to be a director. And I did some theater directing, and I did a film school. And when I saw the videos of The Fortune of Archives, my first reaction was that of a director. And I felt a number of things, and I saw a certain potential. And this potential I'll try to express by practicing a genre called ekphrasis. Okay, I think that I'm not proposing a theoretical discourse unless inadvertently. What I want to propose is ekphrasis, that is a description. I want to put images into words. I want to put the fortune of videos into words. And I discovered that this is a very difficult exercise. Since it is such a difficult exercise, sometimes I thought I would rely on some sort of visual intertextuality. In other terms, images speak other images, and sometimes the images speak other images better than I would. So don't be astonished if from time to time I mention directors, the work of directors. I will mention Hitchcock, and you might wonder, why Hitchcock, of all people. I will mention Christian Petzold, who's a German director who worked with Harun Farouki. I'll mention my former teacher, Jean Rouch, who invented Cinéma Vérité, and I'll mention a few others. Okay, so I'll speak of images via images, and this allows me to be able to dare say something about a subject which is obviously psychiatric, that deals with psychiatry, while I am not a psychiatrist. Okay, so I'm trying to take an indirect angle. I think that I'll deal with 4 videos. I think that I do a close analysis based on 4 videos. 2 of the videos are those of survivors who are interviewed on individual basis. These are Shmuel Ben Meir and Rafi Rakovsky. They are Israeli survivors. 2 others are joint videos. They involve 2 people at each time. They are like double portraits in the history of painting. And these double portraits have another dimension, which they allow some sort of a dialogue to start going on between the interviewees. Okay? So some of them agree or disagree with what is being said. And these 2 interviews are of this woman, Jolly, whose story I told 2 years ago, and her mother, Rosalie. And then the 2 other interviewees are Dorilaub himself and Mrs. L, Clara L, who happens to be his mother. And we have a paper about this subject. The testimonies we hear are peculiar. They are tentative, hesitant, interrupted, mistaken, and sometimes silent. Witnessed situations seem obscure, contradictory, incoherent. In a way, these videos are less about witnessing than about the vicissitudes of witnessing, the vagaries of witnessing. What they portray is how do you reach a failure to bear witness. I think that obviously psychoanalytic approaches and familiarity with the psychoanalysis of trauma helps in understanding the videos. Yet you do not need to be a psychiatrist in order to react to them. These videos are not meant to offer illustrations of some psychoanalytic doxa. If such video exists, it is perhaps precisely to be read in a number of ways, some of which are yet to be found. I think that I return to my first impression, that the videos could be shown as art. They should be called installation. They could be called installation. And they could be also presented as fictions of some sort. And I thought at one point that it would be interesting to to invite someone like Beckett to transpose such videos on stage. I think that I'll speak of the work of Jean Rouch, my former teacher, whose work, which was that of an anthropologist, was picked up by the dramaturgist Jean Genet, who took his work and transformed it in a very famous play, The Niggers, Les Nègres. Okay? So I think that it is interesting to have this sort of discourse which I try to address naively, without situating myself a priori in one or another perspective. My point is to tell you what I see and what I feel. I think that what strikes me is that whenever people show something, they somehow enter into the realm of scenography. There is a scenography of showing, and this scenography involves many roles. There's the role of the displayer, there's the role of the displayed, and there's the role of the displayee, the person towards whom you display. And I think part of my paper will consist in analyzing the interactions between these three type of characters. I think that it is clear that this situates in a certain history, and this is a history of medical scenographies. Okay? There's a history of medical dramaturgies, which is most famous because of Rembrandt, the anatomy lesson of Professor Tulp, and also most famous by the work of Charcot. Charcot was a great man of his time, and he was very close to a certain sort of music hall display. Okay? He was prompting his patients and able to have them do things on stage for a public. And what was wonderful is that the patients wonderfully complied. Hysteria allowed this extraordinary compliance. So there is a history of showing, and there is a history of medical showing. I do not intend to go through this history because it would be too long. Yet I believe I'll take from time to time a point of reference in order to see, what it is that unnerves me in comparison, what it is that I find unsettling, what it is that, something is shown to me, and I feel this something is very far from satisfactory. I find a reticence. I find a refusal to show. And I find this refusal to show among the people who officially accepted to deliver interviews. So they say, yes, okay, I do it. And they say, okay, I do it. And then they stop speaking. Or they speak about irrelevant things, or they move in the corners, or they avoid the important subjects. And I think that, this is very curious. What are these reticent witnesses? And what do they teach us about witnessing? I think that Charcot had no problem. I think that he could kick Blanche, his patient, in the legs, and Blanche started doing whatever he wanted her to do. This is absolutely not the case here. Okay? So I think that one question I want to ask is, what sort of visibility are we confronted to? I think that there is a visibility which is theatrical visibility, which we know a lot about, and which has been very studied. There's another type of visibility, would be the visibility of art, which calls for contemplation. And I believe there's a third sort of visibility, which is the visibility of science, which calls for interrogation. What is going on exactly? Okay? I think that clearly within the history of medical visibilities, we start with Charcot, but when we reach Laub's videos, we are somewhere else. We are on the side of contemplation, and we are on the side of interrogation. You have no doxa, you have no dogma. I know that Laub has written very famous papers about the theory of traumas, yet we don't have to follow his papers or to obey his reading of what is going on. And his whole dramaturgy is one of somehow slipping on the side and telling us, now look for yourself. Look for yourself and be brighter than me, if possible. Okay. I think that pathos. I think that my first idea as a director was to take one of the videos produced by Dory and his colleagues, and to make a film out of it by showing it many times. The same video, showing it and showing it and showing it and showing it. The first time, you would feel bored. The first time, it looks like, some of the videos look like job interviews with very ungifted people who ask for a job, okay? Then you realize that underneath this sort of strange calm, there is something going on. And this something somehow, when you see the same tape a second time, you discover another dimension. When you see a third time, you discover a third dimension. And let me return to the two women that were so brilliantly analyzed by Johanna, and which I evoked because I was under the shock when I was here 2 years ago. I think that the two women are evoking very old facts. Yes, these facts are an infanticide. A Nazi doctor kills a newborn baby in their presence by plunging the baby in water. A further viewing reveals an additional level of cruelty. Here goes little Moses, says the doctor. And then a further viewing starts asking, what does he mean by saying, here goes the little Moses? It means Moses was the savior of the Jews. This is what I'm doing with your savior. It means Moses was saved by water. This baby will be killed by water. And then there's a new layer of cruelty that comes up when one of the interviewees reveals that she helped. Okay, so when I see again the same video, I find this sort of, that which looked like a placid conversation becomes harder and harder to take. And then when I see it once again, I start wondering, did these two women ignore what was going on? Did they just imagine that they were invited to become nurses without anything beyond being a nurse? Okay? So all this, as you go through seeing the videos, somehow layer after layer of cruelty comes to you until something which started as being sort of a placid water becomes a real storm. I think that what I am proposing here is not analyzing this video. I put it in the beginning of my presentation because Johanna has brilliantly done it. I don't need to do it again. On the other hand, it gives me an example. I think that I am much more interested in the story of the single interviews. I'm interested in the story of the single interviews because in a way they are worse. I mean, what I said is already horrible, but those single interviews are even worse. So my point here is to analyze what goes under the smooth surface of unpathos. And this paper is organized in 3 parts. In the first part, I'll discuss interactions. What it is that survivors expect from interviewers, and what it is that interviewers expect from survivors, and how do they manage either to fulfill the other's expectations or to disappoint them, and at what price. Okay? So my first part is doing something which is inspired, if you like, by Irving Goffman. It has to do with the realm of interaction and with the realm of presentation of self. When I'm an interviewee, why do I wear a cap? Okay, why did I bring my cap to the interview? And why did I bring enormous glasses? What is the point? What am I doing with such props? Okay, so first I'm referring to Goffman. Also, I think that I'm referring to perhaps something which is quite interesting that was discussed by Latour, which is an ethnography of these interactions. These interactions involve all sorts of details that seem to me quite important. For example, when we watch the videos, we can consider that videos are a medium. But are they really a medium? Or is the medium combining the videos, then their exhibition in the frame of a seminar? Is the seminar less a medium than the video is? Okay? I think that what I take from Latour is the sensitivity to the fact that an ethnography of a number of events somehow tends to focus on what seems to be the essential of the event, but there are a number of things that seem, accessory. And I believe that we have here a very interesting medium, which is a medium in 3 steps. The first step is the video. The second step is the seminar, like this seminar, where concerned publics are invited, and when the video is discussed. And the third step is the archive. And the archive is constructing virtual publics with their virtual answers, and with the deferred meaning, the postponed meanings that the authors of the video would like to exist, would like to encourage, and do not know yet the content of. Okay? So, first part. Are you okay? Am I? Okay. Also, please warn me when I start going too far.
25 minutes from now. 30
Okay.
minutes.
So first, the interactions of survivors and interviewers. This is my first part, interactions. I think that I start by referring to a French director called Emmanuel Finkel. This director did a film that started with the following ad: looking for Yiddish-speaking men and women between 65 and 90 for a fiction film. 400 people showed up. This was a casting operation. 120 hours were shot. The shooting was awkward. Characters didn't know how to introduce themselves. Director and casting manager intervened at the wrong times. The camera was out of focus, but the result was intensely emotional, and The Rushes eventually became a film. Not the fiction film he intended to do, but another film, which was The Rushes. In other terms, the interviews of Finkel were more than ready to speak. They were ready to speak out. They had been rehearsing their speech for 30 years or 40 years. I think that now let's turn to Laub's interviews. Here are survivors who accept to testify, yet are unwilling to testify or unable to acknowledge that certain events ever happened. The story of those videos is one of solicitations without response. This response is often a blank, a non-performance, at least, I'm saying this about the videos I was shown. And probably when Dorillo chose these videos to show to me, he did not choose them by accident. He chose videos that involved this problem. So I decided to respect this selection and to address this problem. So these testimonies only become testimonies as soon as one realizes that what counts in them is their unfactuality. They are testimonies not by what they say, but by what they avoid saying. They are testimonies not to a situation, but to a condition. There are two meanings of the word witness in English, as Amit and I know from a seminar he organized. A witness is a person, someone who has legs, who stands on them, and who offers a testimony. A witness is also a text, the content of a testimony. In the Fortunoff archives, many witnesses start as persons. They are introduced, they are named, they are situated, but these persons soon become texts. Events are not what they tell us about, but that which appears on their bodies, on their faces, on their gestures, on their silence. Each survivor becomes like an archaeological remain. Each survivor becomes a footprint. I think that, to me, there's a method in the silence of the survivors. Their methods, some of their answers succeed in brilliantly skipping all the traditional questions of journalism. Who, when, why, where, to what effect? Shmuel, one of the characters, is asked about events. His answers speak of context, circumstances. Events are replaced by progressive evocations. Individuals are replaced by general categories. The Ukrainians, the Romanians, the father, the brother. The first person pronoun disappears. He never says I, or whenever he says I, he tries to replace it by we or by one. Rafi Rakowski, another survivor, similarly transforms every specific situation into a general category. This was a war like any other war. The military occupation was quite ordinary. Loneliness in fact, it was the same for all orphans. Nothing stands out. All events and all actions dissolve into categories, into regularities. What disappears here is the very possibility of differentiating persons, situations, and events, of identifying them. I call this narrative aphasia. Okay, there are many forms of aphasia. I believe this is narrative aphasia. I think that there's a clue to the dynamics of aphasia. Then the only events Shmuel ben Meir remembers as events happen to be lucky events. An officer saved his life by releasing him, or a fellow soldier comes out first from the bunker or tank where they were, and it is the fellow that is shot, and he survives. At this point, you have very clear-cut events. You know who does what when. But I think that it is interesting that this capacity of remembering only intervenes in relationship of felicity, in the relationship of luck, in something which is... I think that in the same way, I noticed a very strong, a very selective use of narrative aphasia. Shmuel comes alive when he speaks of his adult life, which he spent in Israel, after fighting the War of Independence. The story of his life is a bitter sequence of failures. No job, no home, no wife, and none of the compensation he sought for all these absences. Rafi's adult life also accumulates failures. Being abandoned by girlfriends, losing the major parts he used to play to other actors, being reduced to playing small parts, being reduced to be given no part at all. All these are still open wounds. In a way, both Rafi and Yosef seems disappointed, perhaps hurt, but what they perceive as an excessive interest in their childhood and history, as opposed to an insufficient interest in what they are and what they consider they are in their adult life. This is my interpretation. Of course, it is tentative. I'm impressed by the poise of both Shmuel and Rafi, these Israeli survivors. Rafi is very handsome. His face is quite organized. He was an actor, and he looks a little bit, and please excuse me if I massacre the name, he looks a little bit like Gunnar Björkström, the hero of the Seventh Seal of Bergman's film. Okay? He has this sort of very closely cropped hair and very ascetic, monk-like face. Shmuel is a solid, ruddy fellow, but he's freshly shaven, he's carefully dressed. Ironed blue shirt, dark blue sweater, he wears a cap, he has glasses. The video in which both appear are unedited. And this is one of the, how do you say, if this was a director, I would say that this is the signature, not editing. Yet, they are edited by the interviewees. The interviewees edit themselves by using all the means they have at their disposal. What they have at their disposal is a chair, is a cap, and her head. So they move ahead and back. They try to get out of focus. They try to avoid the gaze of the interviewer, and they do small things like, okay, by inclination of my head, I can mask my eyes, okay? Or sometimes I decided to look, and so you have this whole thing going on, which makes that the interviewees are quite aware of their presentation of self. It is not something which they leave, which is accidental. In comparison, there's this famous character from Carrère's story, which Rachel will tell tomorrow, who has a story very similar to theirs, and who spent about 60 years or 50 years in a hospital, in a psychiatric hospital. But when he comes out with no teeth, with bizarre clothing. Clearly he has been dressed up by someone else. And he drools, he spits, and he drools, and he becomes totally unaware of whatever is going on. I think what strikes me here, okay, is the very deliberate style. I think that now if I move to what it is that the interviewers are doing, I think that at that point I cannot but, and I'll be short because this has been brilliantly described by Dory when in his guise as a theorist. First, it is clear that the interviewers are traveling companions, okay? And I think that the best example of this is given when Dory interviews Mrs. Laub, and she's the interviewee, and he's on the side of the interviewer. But there's a moment where he moves, and he sits next to her, and he becomes the interviewee. So there's no hierarchy between the two levels, and there's not at all the type of hierarchy that you would find in Charcot. Charcot, was uppity to even get close to the patient. You had a doctor and two nurses holding Blanche, and Charcot was looking only at the audience. In a way, he knew that his puppet would do whatever is required, okay? Second point, I think that I would like to quote now Alfred Hitchcock. Alfred Hitchcock has a very typical story. The story of Hitchcock that you find in almost all his films is that of a witness, someone has witnessed a terrible story. And this witness is not believed. People say it's not true, it is not possible. The ornithologist in the bird says, but seagulls never attack humans. It is impossible, it is unknown in the literature. What is interesting in Hitchcock's stories is not only the characters are told what they saw did not occur, but they do believe that what they saw did not occur. They believe, they start believing, they have doubts about their own vision. And this is, I won't get into detail, but this is almost every film of Hitchcock. So Hitchcock has invented a very interesting character. I would call this character the validating witness. The validating witness is someone who comes to the traumatized person, to the traumatized witness, and the validating witness says, listen, this did happen. You were not it was not a delusion, you did not make it up, it did happen. I believe that the strategy of Laub and the strategy, the dramaturgy of Hitchcock are very similar. You have this issue of the validating witness, and I think that the last point, again, I'll be rapid in this. The last point is that I believe that at one point, Laub is annoyed by Raffi, who says, it was like ordinary, everybody was nice, so, it was a regular situation. And he says, stop it. What is business about everybody being regular? What is business about everything being standard? You are not answering. And I think that what here is interesting here is the anger. I feel the anger of the interviewer. The interviewer is expressing anger or irritation or frustration, and also the interviewer is using anger in a very therapeutic way in order to be able to be the ambassador of the disappeared resentment. It is an encouragement for the patient to be able to express resentment. And the question that there are certain resentments that disappear, but when those resentments disappear, the subject disappears too. And I think that there's in the anger or in the sort of direct and astonishing intervention of the interviewer, I find both this anger and this sort of provocation of anger, okay? Resurrection of anger. Now I would like to move to the issue of menstruations. I think that I would like to say that I'm dealing with the history of medical displays, medical menstruations. And I would start by taking two examples that have nothing to do, apparently, with what I'm discussing. The first is Charcot. The second is Jean Rouch. Jean Rouch did one film, which is about psychiatry, which is about a trance ritual in Ghana. And in this film, he shows a number of young Africans entering possession crisis, in which they somehow inhabit the figures of colonial establishment, and it is almost, how do you say, an exorcism of colonialism. But this is just an anecdote. But what I find very interesting is that Charcot is in the process of ordering his patients. He makes them order, he makes them different. Rouche is another process. He is in the process as an anthropologist of deordering the people he describes. The Charcot's patients start like anyone else, and they finish as order. Rouche patients start as extremely order, and they finish like us, okay? And I think that it is interesting to look at these two processes, which are both part of the history of medical displays or medical menstruation. Second big point about menstruation. If you look at Charcot is offering a spectacle. He's offering a spectacle which is very close of the musical spectacles of his time. What is interesting is that the Fortunoff archives are offering conversations. Okay? It's not a spectacle, it is conversation, and the medium that is privileged is not the body, it is speech. It is within speech and the intervals of speech that a number of things happen. Third point, there are two ways of menstruating. One is when you are seated on a heavy body of knowledge, you display. I call it exemplifying. The other sort of showing consists in not proposing a certain meaning, but allowing things to speak for themselves. This is at the heart of the work of the famous theater actor and actor theorist Antonin Artaud. Antonin Artaud wrote about the theater of cruelty, saying, why is it that so often theater is controlled by speech? Why is it that so often theater provides illustrations of what is already written? Artaud was dreaming of a theater where nothing would be anticipated and where a number of things would appear instead of being shown. I think that it is quite important to me that the videos we are looking are allowing things to appear. They don't show them, okay? I think that, or if they show something, I would say that the showing consists essentially in framing, in somehow limiting the intellectual space within which we'll appreciate what it is that is happening. But in a way, there's no specific display in the form of showing. I think that to return to the measure issue I'll discuss here is a moral issue. It's the issue of regard and disregard. And I would like to take just one example. Let me take Rembrandt, the anatomy lesson of Professor Tulp. I think that it is quite interesting that nobody is interested in the body, the corpse. There's a corpse there, and nobody cares. You have a number of people who are seated. They look at Professor Tulp. And what does Professor Tulp do? He looks at his thoughts. And there's a corpse there who's like an invited guest. He's just lying there. He's just being dissected. He's just being opened. He's just sees his how do you say, his skin taken from him. And I would like to just note one point. This body was the body of someone. This someone had a name. His name was Adrien. His name is Adrianse. It is very interesting that the painting is called the anatomy lesson of Professor Tulp. Why is it not called the dissection of Adrianse? Okay? I think this very simple choice tells you the amount of disregard. Okay? Finally, I think that the last point about the demonstrations of the Fortunoff archive is that not only they're not theatrical in that they are not, provoking spectacle, but they are also not theatrical in the sense of Benjamin, when Benjamin thinks of how it is that cinema constitutes itself. And cinema constitutes itself by, those people who show and those people who are shown, those people who are shown and those people who see them belong in different temporalities. Okay? In a certain way, I would say that in his interviews, Dohi Laub acts like a casting director. He does the interviews not for himself, he does the interviews for someone else. Okay? And these interviews, and the question is, what is the relationship between the interviewer and the someone else who will come at a later stage and in a different space? And I believe that what strikes me very much is that the humility that comes into showing here, because the relationship is essentially not one of identification. I do not identify with Laub when I see his videos. It is a relationship of supervision. I check. I see what happens, and I catch Laub making parapraxis, making mistakes himself. Okay? Like a supervising analyst, I am in a situation of analyzing the analyst, of analyzing the interviewer, of judging him also. This is my last, I'm entering my last part, and I probably have 10 minutes. Yes? Okay. My last part consists in saying that all this has an overarching dramaturgy. That the videos, if we put them together, they have an overarching dramaturgy. And so I'll speak of this large dramaturgy. And then I think that what strikes me also is this dramaturgy, while it has overarching themes, expresses itself in very minute ways, in tiny ways. So what we have here is a very interesting exercise. I would call it an exercise of micro-dramaturgy. Now, to start with, I have to start the overall overarching dramaturgies. To describe it, I'm inspired by a German philosopher called Axel Honneth, and about the discussion he does about recognition. Let me tell you a story first. Mizoguchi, the Japanese director, the life of Oharu. Oharu is an old prostitute and destitute, sorry if I'm rhyming, woman. And when she was a young and beautiful woman, she belonged to the court where she had a baby. The baby was taken from her, it was confiscated, and one day the old woman sees the baby in the street. This baby is now the emperor. This is very melodramatic. So you have, on the side, you have the old Oharu, on the other side you have the emperor. The emperor is looking in her direction, and he's watching her. She's in his field of vision. And she's desperately staring at him. And the question that Mizoguchi asks is, will he recognize her? And the second question he asks is, if he does recognize her, will he care? And what Mizoguchi is playing here with is the two meanings of the word recognition. Recognition first means identification. I know this happened. I was there, and I don't know, the captain shot this and that person. Recognition also means regard, respect. Okay? I care for that person. And what Honneth says is that while it seems that logically identification should precede regard, in fact it is the contrary. Regard has always precedence over identification. Because by regarding someone, I welcome this someone into the society of humans. When I hail someone, when I say hello, the simplest fact of saying hello in an elevator is a form of regard. I tell the other, I consider you like a fellow human. And Axel Honneth speaks of the situation where this is absent. And he speaks of a novel called The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. And he says that what is invisible about the invisible man has nothing physical about it. He's perfectly visible in that you see him. He's invisible because you don't want to regard him. You decide, you submit him to a social death. So I start with this two dimension of recognition. Recognition means, I know you, I met you, do you remember? And recognition means, I hail you, no matter who you are. Now, recognition is closely imbricated with visibility, as I just said. But regard and identification are not the only sorts of recognition. There are many sorts of recognition. For example, you have this acknowledging a crime, saying that, yeah, I confess. It's a form of recognition. Or there's this curious form of recognition that was a ritual in the Roman Empire. A man took a baby from the ground and lifted the baby. It meant, I recognize this baby as my child. It is a recognition of filiation. Okay? So I think that you have all sorts of recognition, and I think that what is interesting is that they overlap with each other. It's very hard to define where one stops, when it is that identification stops, and when it is that regard starts. And this is where comes Petzold, this German director who wrote a film with Harun Farouki called Phoenix. Phoenix is a story of a survivor of the concentration camps who comes back to her husband in Berlin, and she has been disfigured and her face has been remodeled. And she keeps looking at her husband and she asks herself, will he recognize me? And my question is, what does that mean? What does that mean? Does it mean he will say, you know, you were my former wife? Or does it mean you are a likable person, you could again become my wife? Okay? I think that when she asks this question is a question that, opens a whole series of questions. Will he acknowledge the amount of her suffering? Will he acknowledge that he betrayed her? Will he welcome her back into the world of humans? Or will he remain blind to her? And what does blind mean here? He doesn't see her. He doesn't see who she is. He doesn't see that she is. I carefully analyze this example because I believe this is exactly what the videos of the Fortunoff archives are doing. I find the same combination of what I would call cognitive recognition, did this happen, and existential recognition. Whether or not Rafi or Shmuel or Jolie recognize what happened does not merely mean that they identify certain facts. It means that they relate to their experience of those facts, an acknowledgement that distinguishes witnessing from mere knowledge. Witnessing is not reducible to propositional contents. Witnessing involves something else. Witnessing involves someone. Witnessing involves a mode of recognition which we tend to perceive only when it is lacking. Among all modes of recognition, this is perhaps the one that most needs to be discussed because for all of us who are not psychiatrists, it is generally taken for granted. I call it subjective recognition. After a traumatic event, some survivors are left with an abstract sort of knowledge, but not with the subjective recognition of the event. After a traumatic event, some survivors are even left without this abstract sort of knowledge. They have neither the subjective recognition nor the cognitive recognition, or they have bits of the cognitive recognition. And this is what the story of Rafi and the story of Shmuel are showing us. As Lab did put it, the traumatic event did not register, and cognitive recognition may amount to the erasure, the disappearance of affective and cognitive recognition may amount to the disappearance of the survivor as a subject. This erasure is terrifying, both to who feel it is impending and to those who have been exposed to it. And this is why I would like to refer also to the work of my wife, Rachel. I think that she asked why so many survivors who write about what they went through tend to steer clear from their own history and practice heterobiography instead of autobiography. They are ready to speak of trauma as soon as it is the trauma of others. The dangers these writers are skirting is not simply that of publicizing episodes of shame or guilt. These writers realize that the process of writing is out of control, that there's no guarantee that the account of a trauma will be confined to a cognitive sort of recognition and not degenerate in something much more fearsome. Instead of just noting what occurred, storytellers realize that they are exposing to themselves to the risk of a full-scale and, in fact, to a first-time traumatic experience. I believe that the awareness of this sort of danger transpires on the faces of Rafi or Shmuel. Sometimes I feel they are about to speak. Sometimes I catch a perplexed expression on their faces. Sometimes I feel they are about to speak, but they know better. They know that bearing witness is like opening Pandora's box. There's the question is, I believe, and this is what I'm finishing now. I'm finishing. Please be patient with me a few seconds. I think that I believe this is the specific drama. Now I spoke of microdrama. I think this is the specific drama of the fortune of videos. Nelly, this is this German woman I discussed in Petzold's film, scrutinizes her husband's face, waiting for signs of recognition, noting that such signs multiply as the film progresses. Johnny sometimes stops, sometimes he stares at her, sometimes he blinks, sometimes he looks baffled. Nelly is a sentient, suffering woman, but Nelly is also an apparatus. She's a dramatic contraption, she's a platform. Nelly is the dramatic equivalent of the interviewing, recording done in the archives. I believe that the videos are constantly about the moment where recognition is about to occur. Will survivors address the extreme knowledge we know they have confronted? Will their narrative take another course? Will they maintain an obstinate silence? Recognition never materializes, but it constantly hovers over the situation. I believe that the videos of Laub are about suspended recognition. I would like to finish by a strange reference to Medea. You know who Medea is. And to Medea and to a notion developed by a French classicist called Pascal Quignard, referring to Aristotle. He calls this notion entelecheia, enteleki, okay? Not in the sense of Leibniz, but in a more traditional Greek sense. Entelecheia is the moment of potentiality that precedes action. It is the moment in which both action and inaction are still possible. We know that Medea murdered her children, and so did, of course, the Greek painter that painted her. But when that Greek painter decided to paint her, he chose not to show Medea killing her children. Instead, he showed the children playing, and he showed Medea staring at them. Medea's gaze was thoughtful. Her sword was in its sheath. She could still take another course of action. Everything was possible. Medea was like a storm. When clouds start filling the sky, Medea was like the possibility of a storm. I believe that the videos I've seen allowed me to catch similar moments of enteleki, moments of hesitation, of potentiality. Shmuel Ben Meir is facing the camera. He has been asked a specific question. He sucks on his lip, passes his tongue on his missing teeth, lowers the visor of his cap. A struggle seems to go on inside him, like the storm in Medea's story. A story is about to burst out. Will Samuel speak or remain silent? Will he confront horror or dodge the question? Like Medea's painter, we already know that certain events did happen. What we are looking at is the drama of their being uttered or avoided. This hesitation on the verge of the utterance is fleeting, almost invisible. This is the first thing I told you when you showed me the videos at Yale. It was my first reaction. Yet, cinema and video managed to capture some of it. The fortune of videos invite us to change scale. The climax of their dramas takes, interestingly, a fraction of a second. We are far from Charcot's theatrical machinery and from the violent convulsions produced at will by hysterical patients. Laub's dramaturgy is so subtle and so quick that recording it requires a seismograph. I believe this is a seismograph that measures recognition. Thank you. Perhaps, no, I just wanted to say there's always something slightly indecent speaking of a work in front of the author of the work. And I'm aware of it, and I took the risk.
Something else. Okay, thank you very much. We've been talking about these things I think for a long time now, and we're continuing the conversation. And I was struck by the phrase, well, other phrases as well, but this last phrase of the seismograph. So this clearly is a piece of machinery which registers ever so slight movements that are unperceptible to us humans, right? In a general or normal situation, we would not feel those very slight movements other than what we see on the apparatus, right? And I think there is something very interesting going on also here. And this is perhaps my take more of what is going on, that the media apparatus at work here is such that from the very outset, from the very beginning, the media choice to have audio-visual media recording the interview rather than someone recording it as an audio recording or someone just writing it down as a transcription, right? So there was a very, and I think this is a critical thing because as many other things, the most important things are never said.
Yes.
It's taken for granted that, and this should be based on an audio-visual recording, which of course allows to this very minute inscription
Yes.
of something that if we would have used, if Dorian would have used some other device, we would not have had this conversation. So perhaps you could comment on
Yes, I think that I have the task of repeating the question, which is beautiful because at this point, by repeating the question, I'm offering a lecture.
You can change it.
I can change the question, yes. But if I take the essential, the heart of the question, is that a seismograph is able to record things that humans do not perceive, or that a seismograph is more sensitive than us humans, okay? And then at this point, the technology has better capabilities of recording a number of events than us. And I think that, to me, this is quite important. And it connects to a number of discussions I had with Amit. One of the discussions had to do with the birth of psychoanalysis. And I think it's Benjamin who made this comparison with photograph, that photograph brings also records all sorts of insignificant details, which are the sort of a paraphernalia of everyday life. You have what the photograph is about, and you have a number of uninvited things that are there. And I think that there's this comparison that could be done with psychoanalysis, which focuses on language, but sees in language a number of things that were not intended. You know, this other speech, this other narrative, these other voices is precisely what psychoanalysis is about. I think that what is interesting to me here is that, and this is why I said that the approach of the Fortunoff archive is interrogative, that this seismograph is recording things which are so sensitive and so subtle that we have no names for them. I mean, I think that Dori might find ways of interpreting them, but he also knows that by recording them in an archive, he transmits them to future publics, and these future publics might discover the vocabulary. Maybe there will be a new science that will deal with precisely those tiny things that appeared and which I attempted to describe in dramaturgic manner. Okay, dramaturgic manner was like a steno, a shortcut to a real description. But I believe, again, yes, that the technological apparatus that was invited has an enormous role in this. So in a way, I described a number of characters in my dramaturgic description, demonstrators and demonstratees, etc. And what Amit reminds me is that among those characters, there's the medium itself.
There's more than one seismograph. Because you're absolutely right, the medium records something that often cannot, or the person doesn't quite pick up. But there is a process of recording inside that is ongoing all the time and picks up on those nuances, and often that's what determines the next intervention or the next question, because you pick up something that wasn't even said once, and you go with that. I think it's very interesting that there are moments of extreme trauma where the internal seismograph is demolished or is out of action, and you will see it in detail in that vignette that we will watch later today. That something happens in the way the event was retold, and the interviewer doesn't know it, and other interviewers don't know it, and it takes someone who does her PhD on it to really discover it. So yes, the mechanical seismograph is more consistent.
I'm glad to have to summarize the questions, because I think that, again, I think this is quite an important point, is that there's not one seismograph, there's a mechanical seismograph that is going on and does the recording, and there's a human seismograph, and this human seismograph has a number of reactions that can be impaired, that can be stopped, that can be blocked, and very often the reaction of this human seismograph gives the clue to what will be the next question. Okay? So I think that what is very nice in this view is this sort of contrapunctic relationship, almost musical relationship between, on one hand, the human seismograph and the whole process that psychoanalysts call countertransference, and the mechanical seismograph. And there's almost a dance that is going on.
Thank you, Terence Lille, University of Southern Denmark. I'm a historian. I was very interested in your talk. I mean, it would have been easier if we had seen the actual video productions that you were talking about. I don't know all of them, and probably few of us do. But anyway, you were making some very interesting points. Now, I'm wondering, where do your thoughts lead me as a historian who basically addresses these witness testimonies in order to find out what happened? Not how did the individual who's being interviewed perceive of it or work on it in his or her afterlife, but how can we actually trust which parts about what actually happened, the events, the perpetrators, what happened amongst the victims, and so on and so forth? Where do your thoughts take us in this respect?
Okay, so the question is it possible, how is it possible to use such testimonies or such witnessing in order to get some feeling of what actually happened in historical terms? Is it reliable? What is reliable? Where is it reliable? And how can you mobilize it? I think that my whole attempt in this lecture has been to skip this question. In that I started from the notion that the testimony is not about the event, that the testimonies we see, they are not about the event, they are about telling the event. I think that it belongs, I believe, to a whole tradition of, description of speech. The event, it's a speech event. It is a way of breaking the continuity of speech. And in a way, what happened, the events I saw are small cataclysms that happen within sentences. And those cataclysms affect sentences. So I described what I saw. And I don't pretend to go beyond what I saw. On the other hand, we have the chance of having Dohi here, who spent immense time trying to answer your question. So I think that he should answer.
Thank you once again for a fascinating lecture.